they did. This is a very colorful time to visit Israel. In fact, it's a very colorful time to see any Orthodox Jews, because what they actually do is they build a temporary shelter in the backyard to camp in, so to speak. And they actually build this, and they live in it for those 7 days. And what the specifications require is you got to be able to see the stars through the roof. And the wind has to pass through the walls. The intention is to recreate the hardships of the wilderness wanderings. And so you can't make it too comfortable. You've got to deliberately make it so that you can see the stars through the roof, which means it leaks, and you've got the wind coming through the side. And they actually do this for a week. And the point being, at the end of Sukkot, they leave those temporary dwellings to the permanent dwellings. And the whole thing's done with a great deal of color and celebration. Now, the gaps in the sides, the roof, and so forth. And so now, it seems suggestive that of the 3 feasts of the 7th month, that this one really seems to suggest the millennial kingdom, where they leave their temporary shelters to go to their permanent one. It's also maybe suggestive of our receiving our permanent habitation, as 1 Corinthians 5:2 alludes to. But it's just a small point here. There is speculation that the transfiguration that's recorded in Matthew 17 may have been occurring at about the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, because Peter is so anxious to build some booths. He wanted to build, Moses and Elijah was there, he wanted to build 3 booths. And he didn't get the picture. But the point is, his mind being on boats has caused some scholars to speculate that that may have been some linkage to the Feast of Tabernacles. But it also involves a procession that's worth mentioning. There's a lulav. Here's a rather decayed one that I don't have the fresh one. It's been a little while. But there's what they call the lulav, which has 3 branches in it: a willow, a myrtle, and a palm. The willow has no fragrance and no fruit. The myrtle has fragrance, but no fruit. The palm has no fragrance, but yields fruit. And that leaves the 4th item of the quartet is the etrog. And I don't have one here. I'm sorry. We have one usually at the time of the fall. It looks like a huge lemon, about the size of a grapefruit. And it's very, very, very fragrant, has a very intense taste. It's a etrog. And so it's interesting to force them together. One has no fragrance, no fruit. One has fragrance and no fruit. The other one has no fragrance and fruit. The etrog has both fragrance and fruit. And so you can make sermons about that if you like. You can tie it to the 4 soils of Matthew 13, whatever. There's ways to do that. So the Feast of Israel. We've talked about the spring feasts: Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, Feast of First Fruits. Good. We talked about the fall feasts: Feast of Trumpets, Feast of the Yom Kippur, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, the first 3 there's pretty good agreement among most scholars that they're predictive of the first coming of Christ. All the elements of those first 3 feasts were fulfilled, and were fulfilled on the very day they're observed. That's fascinating. Not only that they're fulfilled, but they were actually fulfilled on that very day. These last 3, most scholars suspect, have to do with the second advent of Christ, the second coming. And different scholars have slightly different emphasis or interpretations of the details, and that's something that you really need to study yourself and come to your own conclusions. But that leaves a very strange one yet to be addressed, and that's the Feast of Weeks. It's not in the first advent, it's not in the second advent, it's something in between. It's a very, very strange one. It's one that I think is understudied. Most summaries of the Feast of Israel will follow pretty much the materials we've presented here, but the Feast of Weeks is usually missed completely in any significance. What on earth is it, predictively especially? Well, let's take a look at it. Bear in mind, 3 times a year shall thy males appear before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose, in the Feast of Unleavened Bread, in the Feast of Weeks, Feast of Tabernacles. So this is one of the big 3, strangely enough. It's one of the big 3. Compulsory attendance required. How interesting. And here's in Leviticus 23, verse 15 and 16. And Leviticus 23 is the one that's highlighting most of these. In Leviticus 23, it says, "And ye shall count unto you from the morrow after the Sabbath." That incidentally, as previous, in verse 11, that was describing the Feast of First Fruits. We have Christ crucified. We have the resurrection occurring on the morning after Shabbat, after Passover. That's a Sunday morning. From the morrow after the Sabbath, that's Sunday morning, from the day that ye brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. Even unto the morrow after the 7th Sabbath shall ye number 50 days. So they call this the counting of the Omer. And it always turns out to be on a Sunday. And it's one of the 3 compulsory feasts. But there's something very strange about this feast, by the way. There's no offerings ordained on it. That's interesting. But the main thing is only the use of leavened bread is involved. Only the use of leavened bread. It's the only place in the Bible where leavened bread is used. Now, and there's 2 loaves of these for some reason. What do they mean? No one's sure. Clearly, one suggestion is that it's a Gentile-oriented endeavor because they're leavened bread. It's not unleavened bread. 2 loaves. Some people feel that also imply that's the Jews and Gentiles who both are impure. Some rabbis would argue those 2 loaves are the north and the nation reunited, but again they're leavened, which is not insignificant. Well, clearly the Feast of Weeks, we know it is prophetic of one major issue. That's the birth of the church, because the church was born supernaturally on that very day. We call it Pentecost. The Greek for 50 is Pentecost. I'm using the Feast of Weeks here as the English translation, but many of us would call it the Feast of Pentecost, but in the Hebrew you call it Shavuot, Feast of Weeks. So, Feast of Pentecost, Acts chapter 2. We all know the story. But there's a strange legend that I'd like to share with you. The mystery of Enoch. Enoch's an interesting character. First of all, he's the one that has uttered the oldest prophecy in the Bible, uttered by a prophet. The earliest prophecy uttered by a prophet in the Bible is one by Enoch. What's strange about it is it's about the second coming of Christ. You'll find it quoted in Jude, but it's this oldest prophecy uttered by Enoch is of the second coming of Christ. That's pretty interesting, because one could argue that Enoch was not Jewish. He's long before Abraham and all that. See? Furthermore, there were 3 groups of people facing the judgment of the flood of Noah. When you study Genesis 6, 7, and 8, you discover the flood of Noah. There are 3 groups of people that were facing that judgment. First group were those that perished in the flood. The whole world drowned. Not just the people in that region, the whole world drowned. It's a universal flood. Okay? The second group are those that were preserved through the flood. 8 people, 4 guys and their wives, aboard that boat or that ark. Well, who's the third group? Those that were removed prior to the flood. Well, that's interesting. See, Enoch was translated before the flood, right? God, remember, the Jewish mind thinks of patterns. There's a pattern here, okay? The flood can be viewed as the tribulation or whatever. Those that perished, those that preserved, those that removed. Now, what's interesting, there is a Jewish belief that Enoch was born on Shavuot. He was born on the day that we celebrate as the Feast of Weeks. Just a Jewish tradition. But it's a documented one, by the way. It's in the Tosefta, Sotah, and it's also recorded by Ginsburg in the Legends of the Jews, 6-volume work, volume 5, page 161. And it gets even more interesting than this. The Jews also have a belief that Enoch was translated, raptured, if you will, prior to the judgment, on his birthday. Now, I find that kind of interesting. I can't give you a big biblical basis for that view, but that is their view. And he was born on Shavuot, and he was raptured on Shavuot, according to their perspective. Now, they don't have in their eschatology